Hi everyone, my name is Marlies and in this video I'm going to take you through all the steps to sew your very own jigsaw pants. Jigsaw pants are like a true puzzle. Each pant leg consists of 14 different pattern pieces that basically wrap around the body. They are slightly cropped, have a wide and roomy fit, with ample of ease around the hips and a strategically positioned pleat in the back. This diagonal pleat opens up when you lift your leg, resulting in a great range of motion. They flare out slightly towards the hip to create this very subtle diamond shape as seen from the front and back. This shape can be accentuated when working with heavier and stiffer fabrics, or it can be softened when working with lighter and drapier fabrics. Below the hip, they gradually taper in towards the hem. And on the side of the leg, the pieces kind of lock into each other in like a herringbone pattern. The pattern is fully gender neutral and it comes in two rise options, high rise or mid rise. You get both of those options in 16 different sizes, ranging from 83 to 150 centimeters in hip circumference. All of those 16 sizes are available in 5 different length options, ranging from 155 to 195 in total body height. And you can either buy the pattern as an individual length or you can get the bundle, which includes all 5 lengths. It comes with 3 different file formats. So we have large format, which is compatible with A0 paper or with US copy shop paper sizes. And then there is print at home, which is compatible with A4 or US letter paper sizes. Or you can use the projector file, which has thicker lines, mirrored pieces, calibration tools built in, and a cut list with interactive checkboxes, so you can keep track of which pieces you have and haven't already cut. I'll share the pattern in the first link in the description below. It is rated intermediate in terms of sewing level, which is primarily based on the effort and the patience it requires to sew these pants, and your ability to process the abundance of information that this pattern comes with, but not necessarily on the steps being very technically difficult. It's totally doable for beginners, especially if you're doing faux flat felt seams, but even fully enclosed flat felt seams are achievable for many. You can also see it as a great skill builder. This video sew along is an additional guide next to the instruction booklet, which comes in a very long and detailed PDF with fully illustrated instructions for these sewing steps, but also many pages for choosing a size, recommended materials, fit adjustments, etc. Additional resources like related blog posts, future tutorials, or pattern hack inspiration will all be published on the Jigsaw Pants resources page on my website. So for now, I'm not going to go into detail on any of those topics. Let's dive into the construction of these pants. So the construction of the pants is done in 31 steps, which are divided over 7 different sections. Each pant leg consists of 3 different sections, which can be assembled in any order before they are connected together. The default order of construction follows a top to bottom approach, which slowly gets easier and faster as you go. If you prefer to start easy and gradually build up the difficulty, you can also assemble these sections in the opposite order. So after preparation, you would go straight into the lower leg section, then the upper back, and then the upper front. There are also many different options for seams and finishes, which are all listed and discussed in the instruction booklet. But in this video, I will also be showing many different examples and comparisons when applicable. Just like the pant leg that's shown in all illustrations in the instruction booklet, I will be using the wearer's left leg in this video as well. I'll be using this beautiful green denim because it has a very clear right and wrong side. But some parts of the video will also show one of these two versions in a brown twill and a green twill, as I tried to include every single option and variation for seam finishes in one of these 3 pairs, so I could show you some examples and comparisons whenever applicable. You can either follow all the steps for one leg at a time and then at the end repeat everything for the second leg, or you can assemble 2 legs at once. All seam allowance is already included in all of the pattern pieces, so no need to add any of your own. Now let's get started with the first steps. Section 1. Preparation. Step 1. Let's start with some stay stitching. We'll take pattern pieces C, J, G, E, and F. We will stay stitch the crotch curve on pieces C, E, and F, and then the waistline edges on pieces C, J, G, and E. So about 5 mm from the edge to stay well within all seam allowances. Stay stitching helps to stabilize the edges, to prevent them from stretching out unintentionally while we are handling the fabric to assemble these pants. Step 2. Stabilize any bias edges if necessary. Consider if you also want to stay stitch or apply some stay tape to other edges that might be prone to stretching while handling the fabric. You can consider stabilizing the pocket opening on piece C and any other edges that are angled close to the true bias of the fabric. So when your pieces are laid out along the grain vertically in front of you, this is your straight grain and this is your cross grain. Any edges angled between about 30 and 60 degrees from the straight and cross grain, so if the angle falls into this range, can be considered. There is no definite list to follow, as the exact angles of each piece vary greatly between sizes and lengths, and what might be an overkill in some fabrics can be critical in others, depending on the type of fiber, construction, and other fabric properties. So consider whether your fabric needs extra stabilizing or not. I'm not too worried for this denim, so I will only stabilize the pocket opening for this pair. You can simply stay stitch the edges, like we did for the crotch and waistline, or you can add some stay tape. This is iron-on interfacing tape with a band, for example. A bit of an overkill here, but it would do the job. And this is a lighter variation with a chain stitch, but you could also cut your own narrow strips from stitch line interfacing like this. Or even cut off the selvage of a woven fabric to create your own sew-in stay tape, similar to twill tape. For this denim pair, I added the iron-on stitch line tape to the pocket opening on pattern piece C. Step 3. Sort all pattern pieces in sections. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to mark all pattern pieces with their letter or full name. The last page of the instruction booklet contains this label sheet, with one left leg and one right leg label for each pattern piece. So you can print and cut up that sheet, or simply label your pieces with some chalk on the wrong side, a piece of tape, or a handwritten label using up some paper scraps. Sort the pieces into the 3 sections. In this video tutorial, the wearer's left leg will be assembled for all steps. Pieces A, B, C, and D belong to the upper front section. The pocket facing piece A should align on the right hand side of the pocket bag, piece B, like this. If the top and bottom edges don't match, you most likely have switched the left and right leg for piece A. We will use the right side of the pocket bag, piece B, on the inside of the pocket. If you prefer to have the nice side of your fabric facing outwards, so it's visible on the inside of your pants, you can swap the right and left leg pocket bag and follow the instructions with right side and wrong sides reversed. The front panel, piece C, is easily recognizable after we have already stay stitched the crotch curve and waistline edges. The front thigh, piece D, will be angled at a 45-degree angle like this. The short edge with a notch is positioned here on the top right. Pieces E, F, G, H, and J belong to the upper back section. The back yoke, piece E, already has 2 edges marked with stay stitching, and the back panel, piece F, will end up right underneath. The back hip, piece G, is cut in this direction, but will be positioned at an angle again. This is the upwards direction. The back thigh, piece H, contains a pleat, so make sure to copy the pleat markings from the pattern pieces. This was cut on the straight grain or cross grain and will be placed at a 45-degree angle again. The side panel, piece J, has one diagonal edge without notches and one with 2 notches. For the left leg, we need the one with 2 notches on the right hand side. Pieces K, L, M, N, and O belong to the lower leg section. The front leg, piece K, is the smallest one, and the side leg, piece L, is the tall diagonal one. The front knee, piece M, can be cut on the straight grain or cross grain again, and will be placed at a 45-degree angle like this again. The short edge points up. The back leg, piece N, is used in the same direction as it was cut, and the back knee, piece O, is placed at a 45-degree angle again, with its straight corner at the bottom. Sort the right leg pieces in the same 3 sections, and make sure not to mix up any pieces between left and right leg. The last pieces are the cuff, pattern piece Q, which is optional, only needed for hem A, and the waistband, pattern piece P, which we both don't need until the very end, so set them aside for now. Section 2. Upper front. Step 4. Pocket facing to the pocket bag. First finish the longest edge of the pocket facing, piece A, which is the inner edge. Finish the raw edge with an overlocker, wide zigzag stitch, or bias tape as desired. The pocket facing will be sewn flat on top of the pocket bag along the 2 long edges. So the raw edge can also be tucked under, like this, but keep in mind that this adds some bulk for the flat felt seam below. Also consider reducing bulk when binding the edge. A Hong Kong finish is recommended here. So leave the bottom half of the binding unfolded and exposed, and secure it in one go while stitching the inner edge to the pocket bag and closing the facing's raw edge underneath. If you are planning to finish your pants with fully enclosed flat felt seams, make sure to stop stitching about 6 mm away from the bottom edge for easier trimming later. For faux flat felt seams, you can sew until the edge as usual. You can sew both edges in one go by connecting them along the top edge, or when connecting them along the bottom, the best distance from that lower edge is about 1 cm. So align the pocket facing properly by matching all outer edges with the pocket bag below. Pin it in place, then edge stitch along the inner edge and stay stitch along the outer edge. I will sew in one go along the bottom. Sew at 5 mm distance from the outer edge until 1 cm before the end. Pivot, sew at 1 cm distance, pivot again, and edge stitch all the way up along the inner edge. I sew straight through the overlocked edge. Step 5. Prepare the pocket bag. Fold the pocket bag, piece B, in half with right sides together. Follow the fold line as marked on the pattern piece, from the notch at the top till the concave corner at the bottom. Ignore the 2 squared off corners here, but match all other edges. Press the fold into the fabric and afterwards fold the piece back open. Now mark a guideline, parallel to the outer edge of the pocket facing at 1.5 cm distance from the edge. Mark it with an erasable marker, chalk or basting thread as desired. This line indicates the width of the seam allowance and will aid in alignment later on. I'm quickly tracing my chalk line with basting thread for optimal visibility. Step 6. Add the front panel. We will now connect the pocket bag to the front panel, pattern piece C. Optionally, you can add a folded label around the pocket opening in this step. It can always be added at the end, but if you add it now, you can finish the inside very neatly within this seam. This is how I like to do mine. I draw 2 guidelines with chalk, 1.5 cm in from the edge, to find the intersection of the sew lines. This is the corner of this piece, excluding seam allowance. Aligning the fold of the label on top of the guideline, I move it up by 2.5 cm, which is the distance it will end up at above that corner. My labels have a small fold on either side, so I carefully fold it open and pin it in place. That way I can hide my stitching inside the fold, flip the label over and pin the rest in place. Now we're ready to add the front panel, pattern piece C, to pieces A and B. Align them along the pocket opening, that is the side with the squared off corners. Place piece C on top of piece B with right sides together. Pin the seam and sew at 1.5 cm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance to 1 cm to reduce bulk and finish the raw edges together. Overlocking, a wide zigzag or pinking shears are recommended here to keep bulk at a minimum. The edge will be completely hidden at the end, so binding is not necessary nor recommended. Press the finished seam allowance towards the pocket bag, from the wrong side, but also from the right side. Then understitch the seam allowance to the pocket bag, sewing 1 mm away from the ditch. Fold the pocket bag to the wrong side of the front panel and roll the seam inwards. Press the seam with 1 mm of the main fabric showing on the inside to ensure the pocketing fabric is not visible from the outside. And this is what the final finish of that folded label looks like. Step 7. Close the pocket bag. Next we will close the pocket bag along the short edge at the bottom with a French seam or a regular seam with finished edges. French seams give a very clean result with fully enclosed raw edges, but they're slightly bulkier than regular seams, so choose either option based on personal preference and fabric choice. For French seams, first fold the pocket with wrong sides together, aligning the short edges. Sew the edge with 1 cm seam allowance. And just like in step 4, stop about 6 mm before the lower edge if you're planning to go for fully enclosed flat felt seams later on. Press the seam open. A pointy wooden clapper is very useful here if you have one. Then trim both layers of the seam allowance back to 4 mm. Flip the pocket bag around to now put the right sides together and press the seam flat with your fingers, ensuring that the ditch is perfectly in the middle before pressing with your iron. Finish the French seam with the second stitch line, this time 6 mm away from the edge. Leave the bottom 6 mm unstitched again. At the end, check if you caught the raw edges neatly inside the seam. Nothing should be peeking out over here. On this other pair that I made, I closed the pocket by regular seams with finished edges. So I simply close it by sewing at 1.5 cm with right sides together, trim the seam allowance back to 1 cm and overlock the edges together. Step 8. Align the pocket bag to the front panel. Fold the pocket bag in place now. It should be against the wrong side of the front panel. Align the pocket opening with the guideline that we marked in step 5. The pocket facing should be visible, sticking out from underneath the front panel by 1.5 centimeters along the entire pocket opening. This will be our seam allowance during a later step. For alignment on the other side, the fold of the pocket bag aligns with the notch at the top of the front panel, and the notch on the bottom edge of the front panel aligns with the notch on the middle layer of the pocket bag. Align everything with the right side facing up, because the main focus is on the pocket opening to align with that guideline. Pin carefully in place, or even baste it by hand to prevent unintended shifting. Step 9. Add the front thigh. Take pattern piece D, the front thigh panel. This piece is aligned below the front panel with the short edge that has a notch on the same side as the pocket opening on the pieces that we've already sewn. Flip the front thigh to place it on top of the front panel, right sides together, and align the edge. I'll rotate the pieces for easier pinning with the seam facing away from me. Always start with aligning the ends and any notches. Pin these points in place. Then add some extra pins to the remaining parts of the seam. Sew the entire seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance. Quick heads up here, if you didn't baste the pockets in place but only used pins, make sure you don't have any pins crossing the line where you will be sewing right now. Before you reach the end of the pocket bag, check underneath to ensure nothing is folded. And for many seams in these pans, you have these concave corners, which you can use as a guide for the depth of the seam allowance. Aim directly into that corner at the end of your stitch. Let's get into our first flat felt seam now. For faux flat felt seams, simply trim the seam allowance to your desired width, finish the edges together, and top stitch both layers on the side of the front thigh, pattern piece D. For fully enclosed flat felt seams, I will rotate the pieces so that the edge that will be trimmed is facing away from me. Start by pressing the seam allowances open. This makes it easier to trim the layers separately. Duckbill scissors are very useful for trimming seam allowances. They have a rounded lower blade and a slight curve in the handle. This allows you to cut very flat on the surface while keeping space for your fingers, and the rounded blade helps against accidentally cutting into the layer below, which you don't want to trim. So they are very nice to have, but not a must-have. You can also trim with regular fabric shears. Keep these very flat on the surface as well. I like to trim on top of my sleeve ironing board to have some more space for my hand. And be very careful to not trim the layer underneath. I'll continue with the duckbill scissors here and trim the entire edge of the front thigh in half. I also recommend keeping a small scrap bin next to you to collect all of your offcuts and keep your working area clean. Before pressing the flat felt seam, we'll also trim these pocket layers to reduce bulk. This is why we didn't stitch all those seams until the very end. Now we can easily split the layers to trim them separately, one by one. First, we'll trim the pocket facing, piece A. Carefully separate the pocket layers with your fingers to keep them out of the way and trim the seam allowance of the pocket facing in half. Now separate the seam allowance of the knuckle side of the pocket bag. The knuckle side is the side that touches your knuckles when you reach with your hands inside a finished pocket. The opposite side, the side that's between the palm of your hand and your leg, is called the palm side. Trim this entire layer of seam allowance in half as well. Lastly, consider whether you also need to trim the front panel or not. For lighter fabrics, it might not be necessary, but for heavier fabrics you may need to trim it to reduce more bulk. I will cut the thick seam at the start with my regular fabric shears, then trim the rest with my duckbill scissors again. Cut until about 5 centimeters before the end of the pocket bag, then gradually curve towards the edge. Make sure the last 1 to 2 centimeters stays untrimmed, so you have a small overlap before the pocket bag ends to ensure you have enough fabric for folding. Now over to pressing and folding. Let's start on the easy side below the pocket. The flat felt seam will be created by folding the long, untrimmed edge around the short, trimmed edge, folding them together towards the front thigh and top stitching them in place. So the first thing I always do is to press both edges in the opposite direction, short edge over the long edge. This reveals the line of stitches that we have just sewn, which we can now use as a guide for pressing. Fold the long edge around the short edge until it meets that stitch line. Press that fold well and do this for the entire edge. Don't be afraid to use lots of steam. Next, fold the entire thing over towards the front thigh and press again. I like to use my nails to tuck everything tightly in place while flipping it over. You want to make sure that the short edge stays tightly inside the first fold that we pressed and that the long edge keeps touching that stitch line without coming undone. Keep using lots of steam. The sharper and neater you can get these folds, the easier it will be to get a clean result while top stitching in the next step. Try to make the distance between the stitch line and the fold as even as possible along the entire seam, because that is the edge that we need to catch with our bobbin while top stitching later. On the pocket side, I will take out the lowest stitches of my basting lines, so I won't catch these threads in my seam. Now press all edges towards you again, tightly fold the untrimmed edge around the trimmed edges and steam heavily. This is the part where we trimmed the seam allowance at a curve, where the pocket bag layer ends and the front panel layer takes over for wrapping around that seam. Fold them tightly together to ensure an even transition of duties between these layers, and use a clapper between all the steaming to give everything a chance to settle and cool down. Before pinning, consider whether you will be stitching the next step with the right side facing up or with the wrong side facing up, so you can place your pins from that side. When using heavyweight top stitching thread, you'll need to sew with the right side facing up. If you're working with a lighter weight fabric and using regular all-purpose thread, you can sew with the wrong side facing up, which makes it easier to follow this edge, but keep in mind that your bobbin thread will be visible on the outside of your pants, so make sure your tension is spot on. For pinning, I try to avoid pinning through the layers of my seam. The thickness causes some distortion in the fabric, and once the presser foot of my machine is pushing everything down, the pins can become quite hard to remove. The tension of pulling the pins out can cause the layers to unfold while sewing, something we don't want to happen. So instead, I like to pin right next to the seam and basically squeeze all the layers in place with my pins. This is how. Keep the wrong side facing up while pinning so you can see the side with the pressed folds. Reach underneath the fabric with a pin in your dominant hand. Here again, I find that the elevated surface of a sleeve ironing board helps with managing the fabric while reaching with one hand underneath. Then start pinning. Come up about 1 millimeter away from the fold. Then angle the pin to cross over the folded layers and go back towards the right side of the fabric directly at that stitch line. This is what that looks like. The fold can't go anywhere. It's caught inside the pin without the pin actually going through the layers. On the right side it looks like this. The pin enters the fabric where the fold is and comes back up in the ditch. Because the pin is only going through a single layer on either side, it's very easy to remove. Now if you want to sew with the wrong side facing up and place your pins the same way from this side, it doesn't do anything to secure the fold. So instead I will start a little bit away from the fold to first take a few millimeters on the right side, then apply the same principle of squeezing the layers underneath my pin and come back up a few millimeters further again. For both methods, the pins always go through single layers of fabric, making them easy to remove. Let's now pin the entire seam, placing all pins from the side that you will have facing up while top stitching the flat felt seam. Before trimming, I mentioned that I like the side that I'll be trimming to be facing away from me, which makes trimming easier, but it also helps while pinning. This motion is easier to make with your wrist for placing the pins from below than it is to do in the opposite direction. At the lower corner of the pocket, I tuck everything in very tightly, squeeze the layers between my thumb and middle finger, and place 2 pins on either side of the multi-layered square. These layers can't go anywhere now. Now that the entire seam is precisely kept in place with all the pins, it's time to top stitch. While sewing, constantly feel the area in front of the presser foot to locate the folded edge on the bottom of the fabric. You can use your nails to create a faint crease, which you can follow as a guideline alongside that line of where the pins enter the fabric. This area with the pins so close together and the faint shadow you can see over here is the bottom of the pocket. So I will press everything down firmly, making sure no layers can escape. And even though this pin is very close to the presser foot, which is pushing everything down, I can very easily remove it, because it's only going through those single layers, and I know that it won't mess up my neatly pressed folds underneath. If you're doing a single line of top stitching, you can stop here. If you're doing double top stitching, you can pivot and sew back in one go. You may want to quickly check the bottom to see if you caught everything as intended before adding the second line of stitching. Congratulations! You have just completed the first section. Great work. Label the section so you don't get confused later. This is the upper front and the left leg. Section 3. Upper back. Time to continue with the next section. Grab pieces E until J, everything for the upper back. Step 10. Back yoke to the back panel. You first need pattern piece E, the back yoke, and pattern piece F, the back panel. Move the other pieces aside for now and lay pattern piece E right above piece F. Both pieces have a double notch over here to help recognizing which edges to align. Remove the labels and flip the back yoke so you can place it with right sides together on top of the back panel. Match everything at the ends, match the double notches and pin in place. So with the standard 1.5 cm seam allowance again. This seam gets trimmed, pressed and pinned upwards on the side of the back yoke. Everything is top stitched in place on that same side. A very short, quick and easy seam. Step 11. Add the back hip. Next in line is pattern piece G, the back hip. This piece has a very gentle curve to create some subtle shaping. The edges from E and F are straight, so we'll be easing that curve in while pinning and sewing. Flip the back hip to align it with right sides together again on top of the other two pieces. First align the ends again, then align the notch. Here you can see that small difference in length. The sew lines, where we will be stitching 1.5 cm in from the edge, have the same length. But the cut lines, the edge of the pieces, have a small difference as a result of that curve. The excess should never be smoothened out by pushing it all the way to one side nor the other. It should be evenly distributed along the entire seam through pinning. So pin the notch, then find the middle between two pins, make sure the excess is equal on either side, and add a new pin. Keep pinning that way, constantly dividing a section in half until you have enough pins. To sew this edge and ease in that curve nicely, it's best to place the piece with the curved edge on the bottom. So here that's pattern piece G. That way the feed dogs of the machine will help with easing in. So at 1.5 cm seam allowance again. We'll top stitch this seam on the side of the back yoke and back panel, so trim the seam allowance on that side. Where two seams meet each other, you may need to trim a bit extra to reduce bulk. Just start pressing the edges first and see if your fabric requires any extra trimming. The bulky seam intersections can also be flattened by hammering them before sewing. Secure the intersection with a pin on either side again, creating a small square to ensure the layers are unable to move. Pin the rest of the seam and top stitch the seam on the side of pieces E and F. If your machine struggles getting over these thick areas where one seam crosses another, you could use a hump jumper to help the presser foot stay level. Then just finish the rest of your seam. Step 12. Add the back thigh. Next up is pattern piece H, the back thigh. It will be aligned underneath the three pieces we have already sewn. This corner looks slightly different between the various sizes and lengths. For some sizes, the seam allowance has a small extension like this, which is to ensure the end will get caught in the neighboring seam later on. Align pattern piece H with right sides together on top of the other three. Pin the ends together, pin the notch in the middle, and fill up the remaining space with some more pins. For this seam, both ends have that distinct concave corner that indicates the depth of our seam allowance. Sew the entire seam at 1.5 cm again. This seam can be top stitched in either direction. The seam runs along the top of the back thigh pleat, which is positioned over here and will be folded like this. The default direction, as will be shown in the video, is upwards, top stitched on this side, so the stitching is visible on the outside of the pleat, which looks consistent with the rest of the seams, but a very narrow edge from the back thigh piece will be visible right over here. If you want to avoid that edge from showing, for example, when color blocking or working with patterned fabrics, you can also go for the alternative direction, downwards. That way, there is no edge visible, but the top stitching ends up on the inside of the pleat, so it's hidden in this area. Either way is possible, the choice is yours. For this denim pair, I'm going for the default upwards direction. So I'm trimming the seam allowance from pieces G and F, then pressing the seam in that same direction and pinning everything in place. Again, adding 2 lines of top stitching to secure the seam. And after sewing, we can trim off this excess corner. If you went for the alternative direction, you won't have this excess. Step 13. The back thigh pleat. It's time to start folding the pleat in the back thigh panel. But first, a quick explainer on pleat terminology. Fold lines of pleats can be described with the terms mountain fold and valley fold. Mountain folds create the shape of a mountain. The wrong sides are folded together. The opposite is a valley fold, creating a V shape like a valley with right sides together. So on the pattern pieces in front of us, the mountain fold follows the seam that we have just sewn. The valley fold runs from this corner on the left until the pleat endpoint on the right hand side of pattern piece H. And the lowest pleat marking on the left hand side marks where our mountain fold will be positioned after folding the pleat in place. So pinch the seam here at the top and fold it down until that pleat marking. Fold the fabric as close as possible to that seam. When folding the top section away, you can see the valley fold here on the inside. The pleat starts at a depth of about 3 to 4 centimeters and gradually disappears until nothing towards the other end. This seam, when it gets sewn later on, stays completely flat. The pleat has completely opened up at this point. Align the pleat properly underneath piece G, the back hip. The mountain fold is pushed as close as possible to that seam, and they align with the pleat marking here on piece H. At the valley fold, all edges are nicely aligned on top of each other. Pin the pleat in place so we can sew a basting stitch along the edge. Start right before and end just after the pleat without backtacking, so the basting line is easy to remove when we'll be trimming the seam allowance later on. Press the pleat only in the upper section, right below pattern piece G, the back hip. We don't want to have any sharp creases here at the bottom to let the pleat fall open naturally. First press the mountain fold from the right side, push the fabric tightly around the seam and press well. This faint crease that shows up above the valley fold can be ironed away from the wrong side. Press the valley fold once more to get it extra sharp, then lift the pleat so you can place the tip of your iron underneath, which will make that crease disappear again. Step 14. Add the side panel. The last pattern piece to complete the upper back section is piece J, the side panel. You should have 2 notches along the diagonal edge on the right hand side, which correspond to the notches in pieces G and H. Place the side panel on top of the other pieces again with right sides together. Align the ends, align the notches, and pin everything in place. Sew the seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance. Now remove the basting stitches from the pleat so we can easily trim the layers separately to create our flat felt seam. Press the seam open and trim the seam allowance from the side panel. Just like the pocket layers in step 9, we'll trim the pleat layers extra to reduce bulk. Fold the top layer away, as we don't want to trim that part, and trim the inner layers of the pleat with a slight curve again. Press everything in place the same way as before. The valley fold has a tendency to pop out very easily here because of the diagonal angle of the pleat. So tuck it in place very snug and place a pin exactly in that corner, making sure the part below is completely stuck. Pin the rest of the seam in place and top stitch it just like all the other seams. And that completes our upper back section. Well done! Another section done. Label it again, including left or right leg, and set aside for now. Section 4. Lower leg. We have arrived at the lower leg pieces. The next step is only for hem option B, the double folded hem. For this denim pair, I will be making hem A, the cuffed hem, so the next few clips will show another version I made with a different fabric. Step 15. Pre-press the hemline. We will pre-press the folds for the hemline in the front leg, piece K, the side leg, piece L, and the back leg, piece N. Pre-pressing the folds will first of all help to create your hem at the very end, but the creases will also function as an additional guide for aligning the pattern pieces while assembling the lower leg section, because after all, the hemline creases should all end up on the same side. This fabric doesn't have as much of a clear right and wrong side as the denim, so I drew some X's with chalk on the wrong side. First, fold the lower edge up by 1 cm. You can ignore the angled corners on the sides. These belong to the seam allowance of the sides and will already be sewn away by the time this hem is fully finished. So the 1 cm is measured along the straight edge in the middle. Fold it up with wrong sides together and press the fold. Next, fold it up again, 2.5 cm from the first fold, and press this fold as well. So we have 2.5 cm here, we have 1 cm here, and we fold both back open before continuing. Repeat the same steps for the side leg. Piece L, press 1 cm seam allowance up, then press the 2.5 cm hem allowance and fold back open. Then also repeat those steps for the back leg, piece N. Now that these folds are already pressed, we can use these as a reference for alignment during the next steps. Step 16. Front leg to the side leg. The first pieces that will be sewn together for the lower leg section are the front leg, piece K, and the side leg, piece L. Put the rest aside for now. As I am making hem A in this denim version, I don't have those pre-pressed folds from the previous step, but if you're making hem B, you'll have those creases here. Other than that, we have a notch here in the middle, and another notch at the subtle change of angles near the hemline. Remove the labels and place pattern piece K on top of pattern piece L, matching them along the seam. pin the notch and the other end, and add some more pins in between. Sew the seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance and press the seam open again. The subtle shaping at the bottom of the seam is to allow the cuffs to sit flat without puckering, so don't ignore that shaping while ironing. You can straighten out the seam for pressing by lifting the hem gently over here. Then trim the seam allowance from the side leg, piece L. Press everything towards that side, pin carefully in place again, and top stitch to finish off the flat felt seam. Step 17. Add the front knee. The next pattern piece we need is piece M, the front knee. This piece will be attached along the top of pieces K and L. Place pattern piece M on top of K and L with right sides together again. After aligning the ends, match the notches on pieces K and M and pin the entire seam. Sew the seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance. If you've been doing faux flat felt seams so far, you could consider finishing this specific one with the edges fully enclosed. Depending on the exact proportion of your legs, this is one of two seams that will end up around knee height, the area with the highest chances of friction against your skin. The side that will be trimmed for this seam is the side of pieces K and L. Follow the same pressing ritual as we've been doing over and over again. And top stitch the seam on the side of pieces K and L. That concludes the front half of the lower leg section. We don't need it during step 18, but we'll pick it back up again for step 19. Labeling is recommended again to ensure nothing gets mixed up while we put it aside. Step 18. Back knee to the back leg. For the back half of the lower leg section, we'll take pattern piece N, the back leg, and piece O, the back knee. These pieces are aligned along the edges with double notches. Piece N has those pre-pressed folds here along the bottom if you're making hem B. Two more things that can help with alignment of these pieces. They both have a concave corner in the seam allowance, here on the same side. The other side has two convex corners. The pieces also have a straight 90-degree corner over here. We'll flip pattern piece O to place it with right sides together on piece N. Pin both of the ends in place, pin the double notches in the middle, and sew the seam with the standard 1.5 cm seam allowance. Press the seam open and trim the seam allowance from pattern piece N, the back leg. Press the short edge over the long edge again, then the long edge around the short edge, and flip them together towards piece N. Pin everything from the right side and top stitch from that side as well. That completes the back half of the lower leg section. Just one more seam to go. Step 19. Lower leg front to lower leg back. Grab the finished front half of the lower leg section again and align it to the back half like this. This is pattern piece K, this is L, this is M, this is N, and this is O. They will get attached along this long seam, the side with the two concave corners from pieces N and O, and the long edge with convex corners from pieces L and M. Pattern piece K is not touching this seam. We can remove these labels now and flip the entire front half. Place it on top of the back half with right sides together. You will find two notches near the bottom, of which the lowest one indicates a subtle change of angles for hem shaping again. There's another notch near the top, about 8 cm below this seam. Pin the rest of the seam evenly. Sew this long seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance as usual. After pressing the seam open, we'll trim the seam allowance from the back, so pieces N and O. Keep folding and pressing everything as neatly as possible. We're almost there. Top stitch everything in place on the back side of the seam. And with that seam done, we have completed the entire lower leg section. Label the section again. Lower leg left. The left leg is the one where the pieces are in alphabetical order when read from left to right. K, L, M, N, O. The shapes will be mirrored for the right leg. Section 5. Connecting. Step 20. Upper front to lower leg. These are the 3 completed sections that will make up one entire leg panel. We first made the upper front, then the upper back, and we just finished the lower leg. The 3 panels you see over here all belong to the where is a left leg. The first step for connecting them is to attach the upper front to the lower leg. They will be connected along this seam. Afterwards, we will add the upper back along this diagonal edge. So let's start with these 2 and put the upper back aside for now. Place the upper front section on top of the lower leg section with right sides together. Just like before, first align the ends, pin them in place, pin any notches, and then pin the rest. Sew the entire seam with the standard 1.5 cm seam allowance. If you're doing faux flat felt seams, this is the second seam where you could consider making an exception by enclosing the raw edges. Just like the seam at the bottom of the front knee, because these 2 seams end up around knee height. This seam is intended to be top stitched on the side of the front thigh for a consistent look with the seam at the top of that panel. But if you prefer to fold the side of the seam allowance that doesn't have a seam, you can also trim and press the seam in the other direction. Follow the same steps again for all the pressing, the same technique for pinning, and top stitch the seam on the side you ended up trimming. In the video, that is the front thigh side. With that seam done, the upper front is now connected to the lower leg section. Step 21. Add the upper back section. Time to grab our upper back section again and place it along this diagonal edge. This seam will be finishing up our pocket here at the top, and everything below is a pretty normal seam. But before we place the upper back on top of the combined upper front and lower leg section, let's prepare the pocket. The seam will be sewn like this, with the seam allowance pressed and top stitched towards the back. It's therefore important to sew very accurately through this corner. We don't want to sew too far in, then we're sewing the pocket closed. But we also don't want to sew too far out, then we end up with a gap. We're aiming for a tight fit like this. If you still have a basting stitch that's keeping the pocket in place, remove it now. And you also want to remove this one if you basted the guideline, because that's the exact line we will be stitching for this seam, so it would be hard to remove later. The reason we didn't baste the pocket yet along the waistline is so we can fold it out of the way. Like this, we can easily sew this upper part and we'll only need to pay extra attention at this point. Find that sweet spot where you can fold it away as flat as possible and pin through all the layers. Now take the upper back section and place it with right sides together on top of the rest. You will find a notch here around the middle of pattern pieces O and H. Add some more pins in between. There is another notch at the top of piece H that aligns to piece D, right between those two seams. Carefully pin the rest of the seam in place. Optionally, you can swap your presser foot here. It's possible to sew it with a standard presser foot, but a zipper foot generally makes it easier to sew very accurately along that bottom corner of the pocket opening. Double check the alignment underneath the new presser foot. If you want, use a guide like a magnet and sew at 1.5 cm seam allowance. Slow down before the pocket corner to take a quick look on the inside. Check the exact spot you need to be sewing and stay focused on that exact point. In some fabrics, it works well to create a faint crease with your nails as a guide. Sew as close as possible without sewing through those layers. Afterwards, simply finish the rest of the seam with 1.5 cm seam allowance. Aim directly into this point at the end for perfectly matched edges after folding it open. Take a look at the bottom corner of the pocket from the right side before continuing. Check if you're happy with the alignment. Sew it closer or further away if needed before trimming anything. For pressing, I'll place the panel with the front towards me and the back facing away from me. When pressing the seam open, no need to force these layers at the bulky pocket intersection. This is just for easier trimming. At the end they need to go in the opposite direction anyways. Trim the seam allowance from the upper back section all the way along the seam. This pocket area is a little bit heavier again, with multiple layers. If necessary to reduce more bulk, you could trim the pocket facing a bit shorter or even remove the basting stitch that's holding these layers together. In most fabrics, it will work out fine to fold them together, and the basting stitch helps to keep the two layers tightly aligned. Take your time again with pressing to prepare the seam neatly for top stitching. For long seams like this, if you start pinning in the middle and work your way outwards, you won't have to grab parts of the fabric that already have a bunch of pins in them. So I pin about 1/3 like that from the bottom, then the middle section while grabbing the fabric from over here, and continue like that until the top. Top stitch the seam towards the side of the upper back pieces. To finish up the pocket, align the pocket opening snug against the seam and pin in place at the top. Baste in place along the waistline to secure the pocket. So about 2.5 cm past the seam into piece J to ensure that the top corner is perfectly aligned before the waistband gets added later. If you are making the high-rise version, you could optionally add a short top stitch and bar tack here to close the bottom corner of the pocket. As a result of the anchored pocket construction, the pocket opening is already considerably smaller in the mid-rise version. So if you're making the mid-rise version, there's most likely not enough space to do this. Step 22. Close the inseam. Now that the leg panel is completely finished, we can close up the diagonal inseam. As soon as you fold it straight over, you may notice that the edges don't seem to match. And when you try to align the edges, it starts twisting over here. That's nothing to worry about. It is to be expected and actually even intended because this seam runs at a diagonal angle. The seam twists slightly around the leg instead of being a straight vertical inseam. At the crotch, it starts slightly more towards the back, then crosses between the legs and ends more towards the front here at the hemline. The exact amount of twisting varies depending on the size and length you are making. Sizes near the upper end of the size range have slightly more twisting than sizes near the lower end of the size range. Just align the ends and the notches as usual. There's one notch about 8 cm below the crotch and another one that aligns piece M to piece N right underneath. The stacking order of seams along the inseam, so the order in which they are aligned, can also vary slightly between sizes and lengths. All seams are carefully positioned across the size range, making sure that the outer leg stays as consistent as possible between sizes and basically hiding any inevitable differences between the legs. When rotating the leg panel like this, you can already see that diagonal angle of the seam. Most of that twisting will be visible here along the bottom. Again, nothing to worry about, just trust the process over here. Here I messed up setting up my camera angle big time. I'm sorry for blocking everything with my shoulder, but it's nothing special. Just sew the edges together with the standard 1.5 cm seam allowance. By closing this seam, we have created a tunnel, which means we don't have a nice and flat piece anymore for easy top stitching, which applies to fully enclosed flat felt seams, but also for faux ones. It can be top stitched for sure, but it is slightly harder than all the other seams. If you're new to the technique of stitching in a tunnel, it can feel rather finicky at first. If you're up for the challenge, I'll share all of my tips to make it work, but it's also fine to skip top stitching here. You could press the seam open and finish the edges separately with an overlocker, white zigzag, or finish them with bias binding for very neat insides. Another option is to finish the edges together, just like a faux flat felt seam, just skip the top stitching at the end. Without top stitching, you can also press these seam allowances in opposite directions to reduce bulk in the crotch seam. When pressing this seam, a sleeve ironing board like the one I have been using so far comes in really useful. It allows you to press the leg tunnel on one side without touching the other side. Because of those no top stitching alternative methods, the seam can be pressed in either direction. So for fully enclosed flat felt seams, just choose which side you prefer. If you will be top stitching the seam, keep in mind that if you press them in opposite directions on each leg, the stitching won't align in the crotch. It's not very obvious, because it's right between the legs. I did it on purpose for this heavy denim pair, because it significantly reduces bulk. But if it's not absolutely necessary against bulk, I wouldn't recommend it. On this pair, I will be trimming the seam allowance on the front side. As for pressing, this is probably the most important seam to press really neatly before you start sewing. Top stitching in this tunnel will get very tight and cramped, so pressing it well makes a huge difference. Same thing for pinning, which is where you will already start to notice the inconvenience of the tunnel. Pin from the middle, going outwards again. That way, you can grab the fabric like this without having a bunch of pins in this section of the seam yet. Constantly fold the layers in place on the wrong side, pinch it tightly between your thumb on top and your index or middle finger below, then reach into the leg with a pin in your other hand and pin in place. In this lower half of the leg, from the knee down, I place the pins pretty closely together. Near the hem, they are about 2.5 centimeters apart. That's because I will be sewing this section very slow, going from pin to pin, and I will only be able to straighten out about 2.5 centimeters at a time. For the last 10 centimeters or so, I rotate the leg so I can reach in with both hands from the same side. Repeat the same thing to pin the top half of the seam, eventually also rotating that side to reach in with both hands from the crotch opening. One more note before we head over to our sewing machine is the stitching direction. When sewing in a tunnel, I'd always recommend to start on the widest end of the tunnel. Starting on the side of the crotch curve allows you to position everything properly and start off easy, while slowly sewing further and further into the tunnel. If you're doing double top stitching, simply pivot at the end and sew out of the tunnel without cutting your threads between the two stitch lines. When stitching with the right side facing up, make sure that the pant leg is turned inside out. That way, the other side of the tunnel is in front of your needle and on top of the side where you are stitching. If the pant leg is turned right side out, that fabric will be bunching up on the bottom, making it even harder to avoid stitching the tunnel closed. Vice versa, if you're stitching with the wrong side of the fabric facing up, you do want to have the pant leg turned right side out. That way you also have everything easily visible. Now before you do anything else, check your bobbin. It's never fun to run out of bobbin thread halfway through a seam, but it's especially frustrating when it happens during this one. Make sure you have enough. Alright, enough yapping, let's start top stitching. Starting at the crotch, with the right side facing up and the leg turned inside out, start sewing. If your machine has an option in which the needle automatically stays down every time you pause sewing, turn that setting on. Use the hand wheel if your machine doesn't have a setting like that to manually move the needle down every time you pause during this seam. This comes in very useful for fabric management as soon as we get further down into the tunnel. As you make your way down, the fabric will slowly start bunching up in a circle around the presser foot, so very slow and constantly move the fabric away, clearing up the next few centimeters right in front of your needle. For reference, this is the point where I started. The part I have already sewn is already completely bunched up at this point. It gets tighter and tighter as you go, so keep top stitching very small sections at a time. This is why I added so many pins, so closely together while pinning this seam. This seam also shows very clearly why it's helpful that the pins come out easily. There's very little space here to access these pins, so I'm glad I don't need to use any force to pull them out. At the very end, it's clear why we want the needle to be down every time we pause. We want to stay at the exact same spot we left off, while repositioning the fabric in front of the needle. And that's our hemline. We're almost there. If you're just doing a single line of top stitching, you can cut the threads now and carefully pull everything out from underneath the presser foot. If you're doing double top stitching, don't cut the threads. Pivot twice and continue in one go. The second line of top stitching will be much easier. That's because the other side of the tunnel is now behind the needle, so there's less fabric to hold in your hands at the front. You get more and more space again the closer you get to the crotch curve, and that is how to top stitch a flat felt seam in a tunnel while catching the fold below. This is our finished pant leg for the whereas left side. If you haven't done so yet, repeat all steps until here for the second pant leg. Once you have both legs completed, we're ready for the crotch. Step 23. Close the crotch seam. Turn one of the pant legs with the right side facing out and the other with the right side facing in. Then put the pant leg that has the right side facing out into the other pant leg, pulling it all the way down. The right sides will be facing each other, a line along the crotch curve. Match the inseam and pin in place. If you did not top stitch the inseam, make sure to pin the seam allowances the same way you press them, for example open or in opposite directions like this. Next, match the notch at the bottom of the curve of the front panel. Keep pinning to the notch at the top of the curve and all the way until the waistline. On the back, you will find double notches at the top of the curve, also match the yoke seams nicely and pin the rest. Sew the entire crotch curve with 1.5 cm seam allowance. Reach in between the two pant legs along the outside of the leg and grab both of the hems at the bottom to pull both legs right side out in one motion. If you want to test fit the pants, and specifically the fit of the crotch seam, right now is a good moment to do so, before trimming any seam allowances. You can temporarily pin the side pleats and mimic the waistband with some elastic, to keep the pants up for the test fit. I'm removing the pins from these pleats again, as I won't be doing a test fit for these. Then turn both pant legs inside out. I will be flat felling this seam, just like all the other seams. The seam allowance can be pressed in either direction again. If you prefer to not top stitch this seam, it's also completely fine to skip it. For example, if you want to keep the pants symmetrical, or maybe to keep the seam easily accessible for making adjustments or doing your repairs, even after the pants are fully finished. You could even leave them raw and unfinished until you've added the waistband, so you can properly review the fit before finishing the edges. After all, the 1.5 cm seam allowance leaves some room for small adjustments, like stitching the curve deeper or more shallow. Refer to the fit adjustments chapter in the instruction booklet for more info about crotch adjustments. On this pair, I pressed the seam allowance open, trimmed it to about 1 cm and finished the edges with bias binding. If you skip top stitching along the crotch seam, it's good practice to add a second line of stitching for extra reinforcement along the curve. Trace directly over the first line or sew right next to it as a backup against popping seams. The sleeve ironing board is very useful again for pressing this seam. In the curved area, I'm holding the iron at an angle, trying to only press the seam allowances with the tip of the iron, while avoiding to press these folds into the fabric. You can also use the curved edges of an ironing board to press seams with a curve, as you can press sideways like this, which helps to avoid pressing a bunch of folds on either side of the seam. For fully enclosed flat felt seams, trim one of the two seam allowance edges. I'm trimming the where's left side here, and then I'll press everything towards that same side. When you get to the bottom, try to lay the seam in the shape of that curve. I like to create some folds on one side, allowing the seam to curve, and so I can smoothen out the other side. Use the tip of the iron to specifically target the seam, without pressing these folds into the fabric too aggressively. Every section gets pinned immediately after pressing, and once everything is pinned in place, we can top stitch. I keep both pant legs inside out again for top stitching with the right side facing up. That way, the other side is clearly visible again for easier fabric management. In the curves, focus directly in front of your needle again, the line where you will be stitching. Any folds on the sides are fine. I'll sometimes even fold the fabric here on purpose to ensure that I don't have any folds right in front of my needle. Somewhere near the inseam, at the very bottom of the crotch curve, you can push the leg on your right hand side through the machine. Before adding my second stitch line, I'll take a quick look at the wrong side of the seam to check if I caught the fold properly all the way around. Good to go for the second line. And now we're ready for the next section. Section 6. Waistband. Step 24. Prepare the waistband. It's time to grab the waistband, pattern piece P, of which I accidentally cut the label in half. We'll press 2 folds into the waistband before attaching it to our pants. Fold the piece in half lengthwise with wrong sides together. Press the fold along the entire piece and then open the fold back up. If you marked all the notches on the waistband piece, you will find a notch for the center front on either side. And roughly in the middle, between the center front and the center back, you'll also find another notch along one of the 2 long edges. The opposite edge does not have a notch here, which is mirrored on the other side of the center front. A notch here, but no notch here. We'll now take the edge that only has a single notch for the center front and fold the seam allowance of 1 cm up. Wrong sides together again and press this 1 cm up along the entire edge. If you want to add a drawstring to the waistband, this is the moment to do so. Add them on the side where we press the 1 cm seam allowance for the drawstring to end up on the inside of the waistband, or add them on this side for a drawstring that's visible on the outside. I'll add 2 grommets in the center, on the inside of the waistband, spaced 5 cm apart. For buttonholes, reinforce the area with some interfacing, or add even more reinforcement with some scrap pieces. Add the buttonholes or grommets according to the instructions of the tools you are using. Now fold the waistband widthwise to align the short edges with right sides together. Pin the ends together, making sure both folds are unfolded. On this side, where we pressed that 1 cm fold, you'll find 2 notches along that short edge. These notches mark the gap that we will be using to insert the elastic later on. So we'll sew until this notch, then leave a gap over here, and sew this very short section from the second notch until the end. Alternatively, you can also close the entire thing and create the gap later with a seam ripper, or leave a gap along this seam when securing the waistband. Sew the edge, this time at 1 cm seam allowance. Backtack well when you get to the first notch, then skip the gap. And backtack again on the other side, which is so short that it's basically just 2 backtacks right after each other, looking like this. Press the entire seam open, also the section where we left a gap. Repress the 2 folds while keeping the seam allowances pressed open. Step 25. The side pleats. There's one thing left to do before we can attach the waistband to the pants, the side pleats. Because we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seams here along the waistline, small length discrepancies can develop quickly. If each of those seams is cut or sewn just 1 mm off, you already end up with a total difference of 1.5 cm. It adds up quickly, and then the waistband won't fit. It's either too long or too short for the waistline of your pants. Which is why we're only doing these side pleats now, at the very end. Find the pleat markings along the top edge of the side panel, piece J. Bring the 2 markings with right sides together to create a valley fold in the center. Then move that valley fold towards the back. On the right side, the open side of the pleat is on the same side as the pocket. Pin the pleat in place and repeat on the other side. Fold the markings with right sides together and the valley fold towards the back. Now you can measure the final length of the waistline of the pants and compare that to the length of the waistband piece. Adjust the depth of the side pleats if necessary to make up for any length discrepancies you may find. You can base the pleats in place or leave them pinned so you can still tweak the depth while pinning the waistband in the next step. Step 26. Add the waistband. Turn the pants right side out and place the waistband with right sides together around the top of the pants. Align the unpressed edge of the waistband with the waistline of the pants, so the pressed edge of the waistband is pointing downwards. Align the center front notch with the center front of your pants and align the seam in the waistband with the center back of the pants. Pin evenly all around. If you pin from the center front and back towards the side pleats in these 4 directions, you can tweak the pleat depth once more if necessary. Attach the waistband by sewing all the way around with 1 cm seam allowance. Before pressing, I'll turn the pants inside out again. Press the seam allowance towards the waistband, from the wrong side as well as from the right side. Then grade the seam allowances to reduce bulk. Grading seams means to trim the edges at different intervals, to reduce bulk with a smooth transition. The edge of seam allowance that is closest to the outside of the pants is the one that always stays the longest. So I'll leave the waistband's edge untrimmed and cut the edge from the pant legs in half. Now fold the waistband down with wrong sides together, tuck the 1 cm seam allowance in and place it with the fold just over the stitch line where the waistband piece is attached. Don't confuse it with the stay stitching if that's still visible. Pin the waistband in place along the entire circumference. Because of this gap, we can secure the waistband all the way around. If you skip the gap over here, don't forget to leave a gap along this edge to insert your elastic later. Secure the waistband by stitching in the ditch, so it's hidden on the right side and the fold gets caught on the bottom. You can do this by machine, like I'm doing here on this other pair I made, or you can do it by hand with a slip stitch, which is what I'll be doing for this denim pair. Thread your needle with thread in a matching color. Anchor the thread on the inside of the waistband and come up through the fold to start. At the same spot where the thread is coming out of the fold, pick up 1 millimeter of fabric, directly next to the stitch line. Now where the thread is coming out next to the stitch line, pick up 3 to 5 millimeters of fabric going through the fold. And those 2 steps are repeated along the entire waistband. So once again, going slow, pick up 2, max 3 threads from your fabric right next to the stitch line. That is the stitch line from this seam where the waistband is attached to the pant legs. And then taking a couple of millimeters at a time through the fold on this side. Even when looking from super close, you can barely see the needle over there. Constantly going into the fabric at the same spot where you previously came out of the fabric will help to keep these stitches really well hidden. Doing this by hand takes more time, but it's a great solution if you're not a fan of stitching in a ditch by machine and trying to catch that edge below. Step 27. Add the elastic. With the entire waistband attached, it's time to start feeding our elastic through. In the instruction booklet, you'll find some recommendations and guidelines to determine the right length for your elastic. Cut it to your desired length and don't forget to add a few centimeters if you want to connect the ends with an overlap. Mark the elastic with some X's to make it easier to check for any twisting at the end. Then start feeding the elastic through the gap in the waistband at the center back. I start off with a safety pin, then pulling it until the center front with a long loop turner with a latch hook, and going through the second half by pinching and pulling the safety pin. Once you are all the way around, pull both ends out, far enough so you can sew the ends together and make sure there are no twists. Overlap the ends by the same amount you added before and connect them with a box stitch or a few wide zigzag stitches. Alternatively, you can also join them with a small scrap piece of fabric. Use something thin to avoid bulk. With that method, butt them up tightly against each other and add a few zigzag stitches to secure. Now pop the elastic inside the casing and stretch it out firmly. Pull a couple of times in multiple directions to distribute the elastic evenly all around the waistband. Lastly, close up the gap on the inside of the waistband by hand, with a slip stitch again. Step 28. Top stitch the waistband. Stretch out the waistband a couple more times to make sure the ease is evenly gathered. Now secure this even distribution by pinning the elastic to the waistband with safety pins. Add one safety pin about every 10 to 15 centimeters. I'm dividing this one in 8 equal sections by starting at center front and back, then the sides, and 4 more pins in between. Add as many or as few rows of top stitching as you like, using a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch as desired. If you added any grommets or other hardware, stay far away from those. I'm adding 2 rows of top stitching for this pair, at 1.75 centimeters from each edge. Unless you're using the free arm on your machine, pull the pants inside out again, for stitching with the right side facing up. Turn on the setting again, that automatically keeps the needle down when you pause, if your machine has that option. We'll be stretching out the elastic while top stitching until the fabric of the waistband is completely tight. Stitch from one safety pin to the next, remove it and repeat. Make sure that the tension you create when stretching out the fabric is between your hands. You don't want to create any tension between one of your hands and the presser foot. Pulling too hard can cause the needle to be pulled forwards or backwards, making it hit the throat plate and break. So any tension you create is between your hands, and then you follow the speed of the machine. Really let the machine control the speed. Don't pull the fabric to the back yourself. Only pull the slack out of the waistband and then just follow the speed of the feed dogs. Here's another angle so you can see more easily what's happening at the back. When you complete the full circumference, end your last stitch exactly at the same spot as the first one. Cut off with long thread tails, so you can pull them inside and neatly tie them off over there. Repeat the same thing for the second row of top stitching, and then our waistband is done. Section 7. Hem A and Hem B. And we've arrived at the very last step, the hems. For Hem B, the double folded hem, you can skip ahead to step 31. I'll be adding Hem A, the cuffed hem, to this denim pair. Step 29. Prepare the cuff. It's time to take our very last pattern piece now, the cuff, piece Q. It's no problem if you didn't mark and separate the left and right leg for these pieces, because the rectangles are symmetrical. The only difference is in the notches over here. If you want to use these, figure out which is which and grab the left leg, but these notches can also easily be ignored. For very crisp cuffs, you can reinforce these pieces with some interfacing. This is optional, as it heavily depends on the result you're after, the type of fabric you're using, and which types of interfacing you have on hand. I will interface these pieces with a pretty heavy interfacing to give them a very stiff and structured look. If you do want to add interfacing, take the dimensions of piece Q, but subtract the seam allowances. Piece Q uses 1 cm seam allowance, so cut 2 rectangles of interfacing 2 cm shorter on each side, which will make the height of that interfacing rectangle 7 cm, and the width is dependent on the size that you're making. You will find a chart in the instruction booklet with the exact width you need for each size, so you can reference that to cut out the 2 rectangles. Or use this pattern piece as a template and subtract those 2 cm from either end. After cutting, apply the interfacing to the wrong side of the cuff piece. It will be aligned directly against the cut edge with the 2 notches. Align it in the middle horizontally, then move it up until that edge. So you end up with 2 cm clear at the bottom and 1 cm clear on the 2 short sides. Apply the interfacing as you would normally do. When compared to the other cuff piece that wasn't interfaced yet, you can clearly see the effect of the interfacing on this fabric here. Now we'll press 2 fold lines into the cuff piece, which are also marked on your pattern pieces with dotted lines. The first fold is at 3.5 cm from the top edge, so if you added interfacing, you can use that as a guide. Fold it with wrong sides together, right in the middle of the interfacing. After folding, this measures 3.5 cm, and there should be 2 cm left over here. Press this fold firmly in place and then fold it back open again. The second fold is at 2 cm from the bottom edge, so directly next to the interfacing. Fold the bottom 2 cm upwards, again with the wrong sides together. Press the fold into the fabric and open back up as well. Now we can fold the cuff in half with right sides together to match the 2 short ends. Pin in place while keeping the folds unfolded. Sew the edges together with 1 cm seam allowance, so next to the edge of the interfacing. After sewing, press the seam open and finish the edge without notches. Overlocking, a wide zigzag or binding are recommended here. It's also possible to tuck the raw edge in by 5 mm, but keep in mind that this adds some bulk and stiffness to the cuff. And you also lose 5 mm of tolerance for the stitch in the ditch at the end. So binding is recommended if you want to conceal the raw edge completely. This edge lends itself perfectly for a Hong Kong finish again, which is significantly less bulky and more malleable than a regular bound off edge. Back to this green denim pair, here I finished the edge with a simple overlock. Step 30. Add the cuff. Place the cuff around the bottom of the pant leg with right sides together. Align the seam in the cuff piece with the seam between pattern piece N and pattern piece L. Keep the seam allowances pressed open at that seam while pinning and pin evenly all the way around. Now attach the cuff to the pant leg by sewing this edge with 1 cm seam allowance. Use the free arm of your sewing machine for this step if your machine has that option. If not, you can sew with the presser foot on the inside of the leg like this. Before we start folding the cuff in place, have a look at this 1 cm seam allowance over here. This 1 cm will stay like this, pointing down. It should not be folded upwards, neither to the inside nor to the outside. It always stays down and flat. Now use those 2 folds that we already pressed in the cuff piece. The first fold runs here in the middle of my interfacing at 3.5 cm from the edge of the seam allowance here at the bottom. Once the piece gets folded down along that line, this line, the edge of the interfacing, and the second fold at 2 cm distance from the finished edge, will end up here, at the same level as that edge of 1 cm seam allowance at the bottom. After which the next step will be to fold that last 2 cm around the seam allowance towards the inside. So let's fold the cuff in place along those 2 folds now. Fold the cuff down along the first fold, evenly moving everything in place all the way around. Now it will look like this. This is the first fold, a mountain fold, and the second fold is now over here. Behind that mountain fold, we can see the ditch from the seam where the cuff is attached. That is the ditch that we will be sewing in later. If you want, you could temporarily secure this fold with some pins or a basting stitch by hand, to ensure it won't shift during the next steps. The second fold is then folded around that 1 cm seam allowance. Once again, don't fold the seam allowance, just fold the cuff piece around it. There is a small overlap between this finished edge and a stitch line underneath. It's about 5 mm in this denim, but it can be slightly more or less depending on fabric weight. Make sure it's covering that stitch line all the way around before pinning in place. It will be secured by stitching in the ditch from underneath the cuff on the right side while catching this edge on the bottom. Because the cuff will be folded down while sewing, to access that ditch, we can't place our pins on the outside of the cuff. They need to be here on the inside. Additionally, we can't place the pins too far. This pin is now blocking the access to the ditch. To prevent that, stay within the first 1 cm. So go into the fabric and come back out again within 1 cm from the fold. That way, you will be fully in the clear on this side. The ditch is accessible. You can push them further in. Then they will be laying underneath all the layers over on this side while we stitch here in the ditch. With each new pin, make sure that the first fold on the outside of the leg hasn't shifted. Pinch that fold tightly and keep holding it so it stays in place while pinning the lower fold from the inside. Repeat around the entire cuff. First check the fold, squeeze tightly, flip, and pin close to the second fold. With everything precisely pinned in place, we can now secure it with a stitch in the ditch. Just like the stitch in the ditch for the waistband, you can do this by hand or by machine. With a Hong Kong finish, I like to do this step by hand for extra control and precision. For these denim cuffs, I will show the step by machine, both with and without a free arm. When your machine doesn't have a free arm option, it will look like this. Turn the pant leg inside out and rotate the bottom a full clock turn away from you, creating a twist. This way, it will slowly untwist as you're sewing, which helps with fabric management. A zipper foot is also recommended to sew precisely inside the ditch. Use your right hand to push the bottom of the cuff down. This is to keep that 1 cm of seam allowance that's caught inside that fold pointing downwards, to the right here. Then fold the top of the cuff up with your left hand to reveal that ditch where we will be sewing. And we want that lowest 1 cm to stay down. Don't fold the entire cuff over like this, pushing the lower fold in that direction, otherwise the bobbin thread will be visible here on the outside of the cuff. So with your right hand, push it down, and with your left hand, carefully fold the top of the cuff on top, so you can move your right hand up now and push both down together. Gently pull the layers to make sure that the ditch is completely open and revealed. With my left hand, I can now feel the overlocked edge laying on the bottom, and I can see that I have about 5 mm tolerance to catch that edge. Now move everything underneath the zipper foot and start the stitch in the ditch. Sew small sections at a time, in between constantly untwisting the leg, pushing the next section in place, revealing that ditch properly, and pulling out any pins. Keep using your left hand to feel the overlocked edge, making sure you'll catch it as you sew. Continue until you reach the start of your stitch line, and that's our finished cuff. I used white thread for this cuff so you can easily see where my stitching is. On the inside, it's going straight through that overlocked edge. On the right side, it's hidden behind the cuff piece, running right next to the ditch. Let's take a look at the same step once more, now on a machine with a free arm, which is slightly easier in terms of fabric management. Switch to a zipper foot again to sew precisely inside the ditch. Push the pant leg around the arm of the machine, going past the presser foot at first. I'm using a matching thread color this time to ensure the stitching is nicely hidden at the end. Just like we did when sewing on the other machine, use your right hand to push the bottom of the cuff down. Then lift the top of the cuff with your left hand and fold it over towards the right hand side. You may need to help it a little bit around the corners of the machine's arm. Gently pull all the layers to fully reveal the ditch, still keeping that lowest 1 cm of seam allowance inside the cuff pointing downwards, to the right here. Now move everything underneath the zipper foot and start sewing through the ditch. Sew all the way around, constantly readjusting the cuff and making sure everything stays where it needs to be. And this is what that stitch in the ditch looks like with matching thread. Well concealed. Give the cuffs a good press after sewing. Optionally, add a couple of hand tags on the inside of the cuff to prevent it from folding down. Step 31. Finish the hemline. Let's finish the hemline of our pants with a double folded hem now. First press these folds again, with the pant leg turned inside out. Use a sleeve ironing board if you have one, and wrap the pant leg around it. Repress the first fold. This one is at 1 cm from the edge. Press the fold all the way around. Fold it up again along the second fold, which is at 2.5 centimeters from the first fold. Use a measuring gauge or a seam gauge to check the depth. Press this fold all the way around as well. If you want to add any additional features to the hem, this is the moment to do so. For this green twill version, I'm sticking to a default double folded hem. Make sure to place the pins on the right side if you're using heavyweight top stitching thread. Pin the hem evenly around and top stitch the hem with a scant 2.5 centimeter seam allowance. Aim to catch the fold on the inside at 1 to 2 millimeters. When sewing without a free arm, keep the band leg inside out again, so you can place the presser foot inside the tunnel like this. Don't backtack at the start nor at the end. End your last stitch right next to the first one and cut off with long thread tails. Pull the tails to the inside and tie off so you can tuck them away later. When sewing with a free arm, you can keep the pant leg right side out. Same thing here, don't backtack, leave long tails and tie off on the inside. Obligatory last step, admire your work. It looks like you made yourself a beautiful pair of jigsaw pants. I would love to see your version, as there are so many directions you can go in with this pattern. If you would like to tag this pattern on social media, you can use the hashtag #MRJigsawPants. I hope my initials don't read too much as Mr. instead of Marlies Reukers. But if you want to tag me or follow my work, then you can find me at Marlies Reukers. I would also love to hear any thoughts or feedback that you may have on the pattern or on this video sew along. As it's such a lengthy list of steps and instructions, I had to keep it short and concise. And the majority of footage I filmed was sped up 5 to 10 times to make sure that I didn't go too far over that 1 hour mark. But if you would like to see any steps in more detail, just let me know. I could always create some slower and more detailed tutorials of specific sections if many of you would find that useful. And for now, I think it's time to wrap up this video here and go and enjoy our new pants.